Hello everyone! I'm Cordova, and today I want to talk about a YA trend that has been around for a while. One that you could say is a tale as old as time. Today we're talking about fairy tale retellings. So I have been obsessed with fairy tale retellings for years. I started off with Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine when I was fairly young, and throughout my middle school and high school years I kept on finding other retellings of different stories like Snow White and Beauty and the Beast, which is my favorite. So I have a lot of favorite retellings of Beauty and the Beast. But over the years, I've actually discovered some unknown tales, some lesser-known Grimm fairy tales and other little series that sometimes get overlooked but have been retold by authors very well in the past few years. So today we're going to talk about a few of my favorite lesser-known fairy tale retellings. Now, fair warning, there's going to be some spoilers because it's very difficult to talk about some of these because they're not always very well known. So, spoiler alert for anybody who is interested in reading, just skip to the next book. So, first up is East by East-Edith Pattou. Now, this is a book that I actually found when I was in about high school. I had always seen the cover, but for some reason had never picked it up. And I picked it up finally one day, and it turned out to be a really interesting read. It's a little like Beauty and the Beast, slightly, but it's actually based on a Norwegian fairy tale called East of the Sun and West of the Moon. This book might be the oddest to explain, so I'm going to give it my best shot. Our main character, Rose, is the daughter of a poor map maker, and her family has suffered illness and destitution for years. And then when she's a teenager, one day a white polar bear shows up and says in exchange for her coming with him back to his enchanted palace, her family will be given wealth and health for as long as she stays with him. Once Rose gets to the palace, she discovers that she's visited every night by a strange presence, and she explores the palace a little bit and gets to know the strange beings that work there, and she's trying to figure out what it is that keeps on visiting her every night. Rose gets the feeling that she's not supposed to be figuring out who this is in her room, but she breaks and her curiosity gets the better of her, and she lights a candle to find a strange man that has been in her room every night. And the second that she sees his face and he realizes that he's been caught, everything disappears, and the castle, they're left on the side of a mountain, and the man simply tells her that she's coming for me and there's nothing I can do. I'm going to stay with her forever. The stranger tells her that he was cursed to be a white bear by day and a man by night, and the only way to break the curse was for him to live with another person for a year. And they were so close, the year was almost up, but now his mistress was coming to take him away to a land east of the sun and west of the moon. The man disappears in a flying sleigh, and Rose is left alone on the side of the mountain with the only thought in her head is, I must save this person. So the rest of the book is about her journey to the land of the trolls and the different people who help her along her way. Now, in the original fairy tale, these people were actually the four winds, and instead the author decided to retell it so that it's a different set of people who are helping her, and they each have the first letter of their name matches what wind they're supposed to be. It's really interesting, and basically you're just following her on this journey, just trying to understand why she feels like she has to save this person and the insanity that goes on with her just trying to travel up to the Troll Kingdom. This is a really interesting story just because it is so different from what you normally are used to reading, and I really like that they use different story perspectives. So you have chapters that are written from her brother's perspective of him trying to find out where she is, her Rose's perspective of her journey, and then the perspective of the Troll Queen herself, who is responsible for all of this madness, and kind of her reasoning behind why this happened. It's a really, really interesting read. This is a really great story about determination and tenacity and just adventure. I really recommend picking it up if you've kind of like offbeat fairy tale stories. It follows very closely to the original with the exception of a few changes here and there and a few historical add-ins, but I really recommend picking this up. The next book on our list today is Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. This is also another one that I picked up when I was in high school, and I really love the way Shannon Hale writes. One of my favorite books of all time is her Princess Academy, but Shannon Hale had written that she loved the Goose Girl story growing up, so she decided to take that and reimagine it with a completely different world. This one is about a princess who is being sent off in an arranged marriage to the neighboring kingdom, and on the journey, her maid all of a sudden decides to commit treason and get rid of her and take her place. The princess decides that rather than return to her home kingdom, she is going to continue on to Beddor and take back her name and save the kingdom from this would-be princess. In order to hide in plain sight, she takes on a job as the Goose Girl and uses her knowledge of how to talk to geese in order to blend in and wait for her moment to strike. During her time working as a Goose Girl, she begins to understand the wind and hear its language. This book has a lot of focus on the different language of nature and animals, and it's a really interesting element that Shannon Hale added in. So the princess must find the confidence and the language of the wind within her in order to overthrow her treacherous lady-in-waiting and prevent a war that the lady-in-waiting is creating between Beddor and their home country in order to cover up the bloodshed that she had in order to get this position. This is a really interesting book with great elemental control, which I love. That it's just fantastic to see the way you can use different powers, and I really like Shannon Hale's way of using the idea of language as a power rather than just, oh, she can control nature. This is actually, she has to learn to understand the language step by step, word by word. It's really, really a great read and a very interesting take on a very simple Grimm story. So while this isn't necessarily a lesser known fairy tale, we still have to add in a modern fairy tale. So the next book is The Looking Glass Wars by Frank Beddor. This is one that I saw it in a bookstore and I was so curious as to what it was, and it looked really, really cool. And I've always kind of liked Alice in Wonderland. Well, this takes Alice in Wonderland and ups the steampunk by 1,000%. So Alice is actually a princess of Wonderland, and she falls through to our world and ends up becoming the Alice that inspires Lewis Carroll to write Alice in Wonderland. And it's actually woven as a story of political intrigue and rebellion and war. So actually in this one, you see Alice grow from a little girl to a young adult. And by the time she's about to get married to one of the princes of England, she's actually stolen back away out of our world after she's convinced herself that her true identity was a dream all along. She's thrown back into this war between all of her loyal subjects and the Red Queen. I wish I could explain this better, but it's one of those that you have to it's really immersive. You have to get into the book, and it helps you understand the way some of the writing is. It's very steampunk, very sci-fi. Imagination is actually a power, like a magical power that is descended from the royal bloodline. This takes Alice in Wonderland from being fun and whimsical and makes it extremely dark and gritty. I highly recommend picking this one up if you like your fairy tales a little bit darker and want to see Alice in Wonderland in a whole different light. And our last book, Book of 1,000 Days, once again by Shannon Hale. She really likes her fairy tale retellings, and I can get behind that. This one is actually a lesser known Grimm fairy tale, which is called Maid Maleen. This book follows the original fairy tale pretty closely, with the exception that Shannon Hale decided to set it in a culture that is very close to that of Genghis Khan's Mongolia. It's a very, very interesting take and a very different culture. Basically what happens in this book is that Dashti, a maid to Lady Sarin, is bricked into a tower when Lady Sarin refuses to marry the Khan that her father has chosen for her. Dashti decides to start a journal in order to remain sane for their 7 years in the tower, and she goes about writing their day-to-day activities, the food that they're making every single day, and after a while, Khan Tagus, who is in love with Lady Sarin, comes to save them. Lady Sarin all of a sudden becomes quite fearful and insists that Dashti talks to Khan Tagus as her. So we get this strange mix-up of identities and voices, and eventually he comes to believe that this is truly Lady Sarin, and Dashti slowly begins to get feelings for Tagus, and it just becomes a complete kerfuffle all in this tiny tower. Dashti finally finds a way to break them free from the tower, and they return to their homeland only to find it completely destroyed by Lord Khazar, the Khan who her Lady Sarin's father had originally wanted her to marry, had destroyed everything. Now Dashti and Lady Sarin must travel to Khan Tagus' kingdom in order to find refuge. However, Lady Sarin is still determined that she is not going to take up her original identity. So Dashti continues to pretend to be Sarin, despite her really not wanting any part of this anymore, just wanting the truth to come out and her to be able to return to her normal life. And she's still dealing with these feelings for Tagus when Lord Kaiser comes back and is determined to start war with Tagus should he not return Lady Sarin to him. In the end, Dashti must find a way to save her kingdom as well as her friends. It's actually a really interesting take. I'm very curious to see how the actual story compares because I've never read the original Grimm story, but it's a very interesting culture experience, and it also incorporates, again, this is, instead of language this time, Shannon Hale decides to use song as a magical method. It's a very small point, but it's very interesting to see how she uses that to weave in between Dashti's power and her determination just to stay alive. Lastly, I wanted to add a little honorable mention at the end of this, because while this book isn't exactly a fairy tale, it still has a lot of influence from a very well-known fantasy writer. So this is The Naming by Alison Croggon, and it reads very much like Tolkien. It's very similar in his style. It draws on a lot of history, and there's tons of appendices. The main character has been a slave for the majority of her life, and then she finds out that she's actually a member of the School of Pelennor, which is a very ancient, very powerful school of bards. And the bards are kind of the magic users of the land, and they have access to the magic called speech. And so she's able to escape with a very well-known bard away from her slave master, and she starts this journey with him, and she begins to learn that speech is becoming corrupted, and she's got to find a way to learn her name. I really wish I could give a better description. It's been a while since I've read this book, but I just remember reading it and being just overwhelmed with how intense the story was and how well thought out everything was. I haven't been able to figure out if this is there's actually notes in the back of this, and I haven't been able to find what the author based this off of. I need to do a little bit more research, but it really is an interesting read. If you just go onto Amazon and check the summary, the little summary they have on it, is probably better. I didn't want to just read it off on camera, but definitely a book to check out. So there you have it, some lesser known fairy tale retellings for when you want some fantastical reading in your life. Let me know if you have any favorite fairy tale retellings yourself, and thank you guys for watching my video.